on this issue. Uh, the anti-nuclear movements worldwide have been extraordinary in the sense that it's difficult to think of any other movement that in their heyday brought out so many people onto the streets in protest. Because when you talk about the anti-nuclear movements, you're talking about literally millions of people coming out in protest. Of course, the anti-nuclear movement starts after the Second World War. Before the Second World War, you have a tradition of peace movements, and historically, these peace movements have taken place in the advanced Western world. Of course, the rest of the world was colonized. And in these peace movements, you found particular currents of importance. You found a Christian current, much more influenced by Protestantism than by Catholicism. In particular currents, that's because in the Catholic tradition, you have a just war tradition, whereas in many of the Protestant sects and Protestant tradition, you have a much stronger sense of pacifism. You have, therefore, Christian currents, you had socialist and left currents, and you had the women's movement. So you used to have a conjunction of all of these kinds of characteristics and these movements coming together. And even later on here in the film, as it ended, you saw a connection once again between the feminist movement and the anti-nuclear peace movement in the remarkable struggle of the Greenham Common women when they surrounded the Greenham Common camp where you had nuclear missiles, and they surrounded for 2 years. And of course, one person, Rebecca Johnson, recently, who was one of the stalwarts of the Greenham Common women, actually came here recently, and she gave a presentation that was organized by us. So you had these different currents. Historically, for about 150 years, until the last 30 years, when you talked about internationalism, when you talked about the peace movement, you were talking about the left. Today, in the last 30 years, the banner of internationalism has actually been appropriated by the right. They're the ones who now talk much more in the name of globalization elsewhere. Anyway, that history is important, but from there was a difference between the period before and after the First World War and in the run-up to the Second World War, in the sense that the First World War was generally seen as a great disaster. And you had a very, very strong peace movement at that time. Whereas the Second World War was seen by most people in the West as a just war. And therefore, you did not have as strong a peace movement in the prelude towards the Second World War as you did with regard to the First World War. The dropping of the bomb, of course, created a new kind of movement, and that's, of course, the anti-nuclear movement. And it got a lot of resonance from the fact that after this, the dropping of the bombs, in the United States, you also had particular groups, not just Christian groups, not as I just said, the women's groups, or the peace movement, or the left groups. You also had, in addition to this, for the first time, what was called a support from scientists, particularly what we call the Federation of American Scientists. Because nuclear weapons threw up a peculiar moral problem for scientists. So much so that you had many, many scientists. One of them, of course, came in the film here, Joseph Rotblat, who walked out of the Manhattan Project. You had Einstein, who first, in fact, had supported for fear of the Germans getting the bomb, but subsequently came out in strong opposition. You had scientists like Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize, who were staunch anti-nuclear activists. You had philosophers like Bertrand Russell and so on. You, in fact, had in one third world country a particular scientist who also won a Nobel Prize, not by working in the laboratories of the West, of the advanced West, but in his own poor third world country. And that particular person who won the Nobel Prize, a scientist, actually said that scientists should starve rather than help make nuclear weapons. I don't know if you know who that scientist was or what that third world country was. It was, in fact, C.V. Raman from India in 1957. Compare that, if you like, to the Abdul Kalams and the R. Chidambarams of today. So you also had a very important input from scientists, scholars of various kinds after the Second World War. But you will notice that the anti-nuclear movements took place basically in the advanced world. Europe, East and West, Britain, of course, the United States, Japan. These were the areas in which you had strong, powerful anti-nuclear movements. The British anti-nuclear movement was distinctive. In Europe, you had it in Eastern Europe, but these were movements that were largely controlled during the Cold War period by the communist governments of the time, which meant that they had a lot of funding. There was some coming together of this wing of the global anti-nuclear movement, controlled by the governments in the communist bloc, and the independent anti-nuclear movements of the West. Independent, if you like, of political control. In fact, in the United States, you will find that most powerful movements which have been very, very progressive have not been led by either the Democrats or the Republicans. In fact, two of the great transformative movements of the United States, the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, take place outside of the framework of the two parties. And then because of their impact, they have an impact on the Democrats and the Republican governments. But they take place as they had to, outside of the framework. That gives you an idea, if you like, of the nature of those political parties. But one of the strengths of the Western anti-nuclear movements, and of that in Japan, was that they were independent from political control by parties. So even though there was some coming together, they tended to move in a different direction. The Eastern global anti-nuclear movements had much more money. They could organize conferences, this, that, etc., but did not have quite the credibility of the independent anti-nuclear movements. And that's because on certain occasions, when, for example, the Soviet Union undertook policies which were condemned by progressives worldwide, the Russian and the Eastern European anti-nuclear movements would support them. For example, the invasion of Hungary in 1956, the intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Nonetheless, I said that these were movements that brought out a huge number of people. Britain, let's talk about Britain first. In Britain, it really emerges in the 1950s. By the middle of the 1960s, the strength of the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, declines, and what you have is a movement into the anti-Vietnam War movement. So the anti-Vietnam War movement, if you like, supplants the CND and the impact that it had on politics. Nevertheless, Britain is the only country in the world in which the anti-nuclear movement was so strong that on two occasions, the main party in opposition, when in opposition, said that if it comes to power, when it comes to power, it will go in for unilateral nuclear disarmament. This happened on two occasions within Britain. The Labour Party were in opposition, first under the leadership of Hugh Gaitskell, second under the leadership of Michael Kinnock. On both occasions, when out of power, promised that when it comes to power, it will go in for unilateral nuclear disarmament. Of course, in both cases, the Labour Party betrays its commitment. But nevertheless, in no other party did you ever have, no other country did you ever have this situation of a political party, one of the main claimants for political power, actually making such a commitment. Subsequently, of course, there was talk about getting rid of Trident and the nuclear arsenal and so on. But even today, in Britain, there is going to be in 2014 a referendum on Scotland. Why is this important? About whether Scotland is going to be independent or not? Because the British now have only a nuclear submarine arm. They don't have your airs and all. You don't have a triadic deployment system as you have in the United States, or what India is trying to do. And their Trident submarines, the most important base for that is actually in Scotland. And if Scotland goes independent, then they're going to kick out the fast-lane nuclear submarine bases from there. Therefore, there's a lot of pressure on Scotland not to go in for independence here. But that's also, if you like, a legacy of the particular character of Britain in terms of having such a strong anti-nuclear movement here. You're talking about the 50s, you're talking about the early 60s, and then you're talking later on, when the anti-Vietnam War movement takes on, it becomes important shape. You also have very important differences between the United States and Europe. the peace movements in the United States and the peace movements in Europe, and the anti-nuclear movements in the United States and the anti-nuclear movements in Europe were different. I'm talking about Western Europe, of course. They were different in the sense that in Western Europe and Britain, they were always more radical. And this was expressed itself in a variety of ways. For example, you had a huge anti-nuclear, anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, and you had a very powerful anti-Vietnam War movement in Europe, spreading across all the countries. Incidentally, the one Western European country in which you did not have a strong anti-nuclear movement was France. Yeah? Elsewhere, of course, in Western Europe, you always had that. But you did have a strong anti-Vietnam War movement, which in Western Europe was called the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. The central slogan of the American anti-Vietnam War movement was "Troops out now." The central slogan of the European anti-Vietnam War movement was "Victory to the NLF." These are two very different political perspectives and messages that one is getting across. And even today, there has not been any, even today, the overwhelming majority of the people of the United States don't come to terms with its imperial character. They see the United States as having made mistakes. Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated when he was going to become a presidential candidate, and he talked about Vietnam being a mistake, only talked about Vietnam being a mistake, not that the United States was wrong. So you have this there. On the nuclear front, you have a revival of the anti-nuclear movement from the mid-late 70s onwards. This is, of course, related to the whole question of the new, what is called the Second Cold War, which emerged, and the growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's often forgotten that as a result of the Vietnam War and elsewhere, there were shifts in the relationship of forces globally. There was a period in which the shift of relationship of forces took place towards the Eastern Bloc, towards the Soviet Union. There was also the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan and so on. There was the deliberate attempt by the United States to ratchet up hostilities in order to reverse that relationship of forces. After their defeat in 1975 in Vietnam, the United States of America does not dare to intervene militarily anywhere for a period of something like 8 years, until its invasion in 1983 in Grenada. Whereas before 1975 and its defeat in Vietnam, you'll find that there's been a series of military interventions by the United States. And now, after, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc, you have military interventions in the name of human rights, what's often called the imperialism of human rights. In the 1970s, again, you had a huge explosion, a huge, literally millions coming out, both in the United States and in Europe. And this time, when it came out in Europe, you had the emergence of an A&D, a European nuclear disarmament movement, which cut across both West and East. Again, there was a huge difference. What was the central perspective of the huge anti-nuclear movements in the United States? It was for a freeze. In Europe, the anti-nuclear movement posits a much stronger goal. This was related to the fact of what was called the installation of Pershing and cruise missiles, which were seen as first strike weapons, and which would have created Europe as a target, as a battleground, if you like, for the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there, the central perspective was for the elimination of nuclear weapons, for the establishment of a nuclear weapons-free zone, as they used to say, from Poland to Portugal. So again, you find a difference, reflecting the different political character of progressive forces in both the United States and in Europe. And that, in the early 80s, was a literally huge movement that took place. Nevertheless, you find that by the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, the great anti-nuclear movements have disappeared. In Japan, the independent anti-nuclear movement really starts in 1955, after a hydrogen test had actually afflicted radiation sickness on the crew of a ship called the Lucky Dragon. And then from that time on, you have the development of an independent anti-nuclear movement, but which is connected and historically exist today, two major anti-nuclear movements which are connected on one hand to the Communist Party of Japan and on the other hand towards what was the social democratic forces and their trade union base in Japan. So you had Japan, you've had North America, and you've had Europe as the places here. Why is it that you've not had, first of all, what is the basic reason for these huge movements? The basic reason for this, of course, is very simple. It was the question of fear. One of the great problems in establishing a long-lasting movement is that how long can you establish a popular movement on the basis of fear? The fear was real. There were many periods during the whole Cold War context in which tensions got greatly heightened. If you read the literature, you know that there were many, many occasions on which nuclear weapons came close to being used. Leave aside the question of accidents. There were a number of occasions on which there was serious consideration given, especially by the United States, on the possible use of nuclear weapons. You had a history of nuclear blackmail being attempted at various points. You had in Korea a consideration in which Clement Attlee actually went to see Truman and to say that, look, don't go ahead with this. You had, of course, during the Vietnam War. You had it later on a number of occasions. You had, of course, the whole tension that took place in 1963 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they came very close and they were so shaken by it that there were a series of progressive developments that took place, the Partial Test Ban Treaty and so on. You had these, but a huge problem is that you cannot really sustain a large, continuous, progressive movement on the basis of fear. That's like saying, oh, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. It doesn't happen. How do you sustain it? And it's not at all surprising that after the end of the Cold War, when the fear of a global Holocaust has, if you like, receded greatly, that you don't have now those large movements that you had at that particular time. The fear now is much more of a regional possibility, and I'll talk about that over here. And we'll also have to ask ourselves, why is it that outside of the advanced world, you don't have the same kind of mass movements? What then can the anti-nuclear movements do? An interesting point, of course, about even those anti-nuclear movements that took place there, is that there in North America and in the United States and in Europe, there was a connection between the anti-nuclear weapons movement and the anti-nuclear energy movement as well. But they were specifically movements that were focused on these two issues. One of the differences that takes place is that you have to pay attention to the political context in which these movements took place, and the United States. In the United States, the strongest anti-nuclear movements, for example, Peace Now and others, hesitate to take positions with regard to other aspects of the peace movement. For example, the question of militarism in general, the question of whether the United States is right or wrong to go into Afghanistan or Iraq. The thinking behind this, of course, is that many people in the United States who are opposed to nuclear weapons on whatever grounds, normally moral grounds and so on, because of course it raises distinctive moral dilemmas, should not be put off. And in order for us to have as wide a base as possible, we should not take a stand on issues like Iraq or Afghanistan. That was the view here. In Britain and elsewhere, you will find that the nature of the leadership of the anti-nuclear movement, and this is an important fact, moved in the other direction. And therefore, it also coordinated with, and was not going to hesitate to take positions against the attack on Iraq. So I don't know how many of you remember, but in February 15th, 2003, you had some of the greatest, I think 15 million people on that one day, all over the world, came out in opposition to the American assault on Iraq. And the CND in Britain was a crucial component of that kind of mobilization. In other words, you have a distinction between certain kinds of anti-nuclear movements which see themselves as necessarily having to restrict themselves to only opposing nuclear weapons or nuclear energy. And then you have on the other side a movement that says, in order for us to oppose nuclear weapons is not enough, nor just nuclear energy, we also have to take on the question of militarism in a much wider sense and also oppose that, and also oppose other military ventures. So you can see that anti-nuclear movements have also moved in different directions. One of the most important aspects about why you've had these anti-nuclear movements there is that their social base tends to be a progressive middle class. That's the social base from which any number of activists come from. And if you have a strong and substantial middle class, and if within that middle class you have a strong Christian element, you have a strong women's movement and so on, you have, if you like, a basis for a strong peace movement and an anti-nuclear movement. In countries like India and elsewhere, for a long time we did not have that kind of middle class radicalism. Today, what is called the Indian middle class, which is basically the top 20% of the Indian population, and is not a median category, many of us would say is hardly a social base which has radical or progressive inclinations. Rather, many might argue that it's really the most important base for reactionary right-wing politics of various kinds. So you don't really have any kind of an strong anti-nuclear movement. In fact, after the 1998 tests, what we have found are two interesting aspects. On one hand, the opposition to the 1998 nuclear tests in India came from a whole range of groups which have nothing to do with questions of peace or nuclear weapons or even nuclear energy. So you had in 1998 any number of organizations coming together and opposing that. There were women's organizations, tribal organizations, development groups, displacement organizations, Narmada Bachao Andolan, all kinds of groups. And the basic common factor was, insofar as they are connected to various kinds of progressive struggles in India, they see, or they saw 1998 as something that was fundamentally immoral and something that, of course, was fundamentally wasteful in terms of the amount of money that was spent on that direction here. So you had a coming together. So it is very different from the Western and Japanese anti-nuclear movements, where the biggest problem for the Western and Japanese anti-nuclear movements is that how do they make connections to other kinds of organizations and other kinds of progressive movements of various kinds. And therefore there have been, if you like, single sector movements or two sector movements, specific issue movements. They've not been able to connect to a whole range of other organizations. In India, interestingly enough, the problem has been slightly the reverse. There is no problem in other groups being able to see the necessity of opposing it. But because they are so divided, they are so preoccupied, and you don't have that large base of the middle class or the radical movements that you had there, you've not been able to generate a mass movement. In any kind of anti-nuclear movement, there will be two phases. The first phase is one of seeking to delegitimize what governments do. Governments want to do two things. They want to be able to pursue the policies that they think right. And secondly, they want to persuade other people, or as many people as possible, that their policies are right. The anti-nuclear movements in India are not at the stage at which they can stop them from pursuing their policies that they want. They know that. So the role that the anti-nuclear movements in India have played is being something like an irritant. In other words, they're not able to actually alter their policies. At most, what they can do is they can affect their attempt to legitimize those policies, the second aspect, if you like. And even here, let's be very frank, it's been very limited with regard to the extent to which they've done that. It's only when a movement becomes very, very large. So the first stage is that you attack the legitimacy of the movement. The second phase is that if you become larger, you can actually have some impact on policies. If this is the picture here, in India and elsewhere, a question arises: how successful have these huge anti-nuclear movements been? On one hand, it's difficult to think of movements that have brought so many millions across the world onto the streets. On the other hand, we still have nuclear weapons. You still have a nuclear arms race. So the question that arises is, how successful have they been? Or have they been failures? Your judgment of how successful they are is going to be based upon the criteria that you use. On the one hand, there is absolutely no doubt that these enormous movements did produce an incredible amount of literature, that they had a tremendous impact in terms of awareness and in generating awareness. How much impact did they have on policies? Gorbachev himself said that in the 1980s, when he moved towards the 1987 intermediate missile treaty, he said that the anti-nuclear movements of Europe had a huge impact. That was one example, unlike the whole Cold War period, in which you did not simply have a management of the arms race, you actually had for the first time the elimination of a whole class of nuclear weapons. So that could be counted as one real success of the anti-nuclear movement, a contributing factor. But what about the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used to this day, in spite of the fact that there have been a number of occasions on which governments which have nuclear weapons have come close to using it? Here, one view is, and this is certainly my view, that enormous credit must be given to the global anti-nuclear movements. Why? Because I believe that one of the most important barriers that has actually prevented governments from using nuclear weapons, even when they have been losing wars against non-nuclear countries here, has been the moral issue. Even among the United States of America, it's very interesting that if you take a poll, the majority of Americans will still say that the United States should have nuclear weapons. And yet, the majority of the American population would not be for the use of nuclear weapons, even in Vietnam. What I would want to suggest to you is that that moral recognition that these are distinctive and peculiar weapons, weapons of a last resort in many ways, which have this character and should not be used, is itself one of the most important barriers. The other argument you can use is that no, the reason why there has been no nuclear war after 1945 or no nuclear use is because deterrence has worked. That's a very common view. In my view, that's a complete mistake. But there is always a problem in arguing for or against deterrence, because the question of whether you want nuclear weapons or whether nuclear weapons are related to security basically stand or fall with regard to the question of whether deterrence works or not. And there is a problem here, which means that you will continue to have two sides saying no, deterrence does not work, and another side saying that deterrence does work, because it's what's called a counterfactual. You're trying to prove something that has not happened, which is much more difficult than trying to prove something that has happened. I can say, for example, that Moshoumi has not become Prime Minister of India. Because she has not become Prime Minister of India, India has not collapsed. In fact, India has not collapsed. Moshoumi has not become Prime Minister. Right? Is this a correlation, or is this a cause and effect relationship? The argument about deterrence is that you need to have a certain second strike capacity in order to be able to protect yourself in terms of security. How that does not explain this enormous overkill in which we have such an enormous amount of nuclear weapons that you can't justify in the name of deterrence. Even someone like Kenneth Waltz, who's, be very careful, says more may be better. He doesn't say more is better, he says more may be better. Has to accept that the amount of nuclear weapons that exist between the major powers, the United States and Russia, etc., is much, much more than is required in order to have security or for deterrence to work. The question then becomes why? All that the RAND Corporation and he and Ashley Tellis and all can say is, well, they didn't listen to us. They are believing in deterrence by denial and not deterrence by punishment. The question is, why don't they listen to you? Why is it? And of course, anti-nuclear activists point out that there is, if you like, a degenerative logic behind the whole question of nuclear weapons and thinking that nuclear weapons give security. The question of deterrence is particularly important. Let me try to make it as simple as possible, try to understand it. Question: do nuclear weapons deter? The answer to this is yes. Does my book card deter? Yes. But deterrence is not the simple registration of the property of being able to deter. Deterrence is something else. Deterrence is a rationalization, a theorization that this property of being able to deter is something that you should rely on in the long term for your security, which is a completely different proposition. This, I think, is very, very important to grasp. If you like, nuclear weapons do not, or the reality of nuclear weapons do not create deterrence. It's the other way around. Deterrence is created in order to cope with the reality of nuclear weapons. So when you have the proliferation of nuclear weapons, you don't have the proliferation or the extension of deterrence. The proliferation of nuclear weapons implies and means that you will have the proliferation of theories of deterrence to justify that proliferation. So I think you have to be very, very careful. And of course, the central argument of deterrence is by its very nature an ahistorical, asocial argument, which means that it is fundamentally modular. It can be used by anyone. If you can use it, India can use it because China has it, then Iran can use it because, of course, the Israelis have it, and they have it, and elsewhere here. There are very, very few people, not even Kenneth Walls, who is also very cautious, who will say that since nuclear weapons bring you security, let them have more and more countries have nuclear weapons, because that will in fact provide greater security. And if you don't really believe it, and even all of the people who use this argument say this, that they don't really believe it is okay with us, then the only way that they can rationalize is to have this kind of division between nuclear goodies and nuclear baddies. As long as we have nuclear weapons, it's okay. So India is okay, but Pakistan is not. Or the Israel is okay, but Iran is not. Or the United States is okay, but North Korea is not, or whatever. So you have, if you like, this kind of an argument that you then have to take seriously. It's an indication, if you like, of the real dilemma and problem of deterrence. Can nuclear weapons be used? We have been lucky. One of the things about nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons is that you will find that there is very little, if you like, movement from those who are against nuclear weapons to defecting to the other camp of becoming supporters of nuclear weapons. You will find that the reverse is much more the case. That people who once upon a time believe in the efficacy of nuclear weapons at some time shift and defect to the other side. If you like, the proportion of defectors from the idea that nuclear deterrence is something that we can rely on for our safety is much greater than the reverse flow. But it tends to happen in retirement. It's the retirement syndrome. You spend a whole lifetime in your career as Kissinger or this or that or whatever, George Lee Butler, whatever, advocating nuclear weapons, saying that we need to have it, etc. And then after you retire from your career, you then come to terms and you say, no, 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 this is something else. And you have it, of course, in the Soviet Union, among former people who used to support it, and so on. It's a kind of what's often called a retirement syndrome in terms of the movement here. But it does indicate some of the huge problems. What's happened now, and what's the situation now? the absence, and incidentally, in the film you will also notice something else. You had great movements of the 60s, 50s, 60s, late 70s, 80s. But we're now talking about 2013. That film was made in 2010. I'm sure you would have noticed that the members or the legatees or the people who were very much a part of the anti-nuclear movement and who continue to be part of the anti-nuclear movement there were rather old. You would have noticed most of them had white hair, right? This is not a movement which now attracts young people in the United States or in Europe and elsewhere. And this is obviously related to the fact that the sense of fear that there could be a global nuclear holocaust has greatly diminished. Insofar as many of them still continue to survive and cope, they're connected to the question of militarism, and I believe that this is very, very important. If we are going to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons, you are going to have to move at different levels, and you can't get away from the fact that even as one advocates the question of opposing nuclear weapons in one's own countries, there is also the question of the United States in this process as well. And how are we going to do that? Nuclear weapons are the most extreme form of military power. They are so extreme that many people think that they are fundamentally astrategic. They are so, in effect, useless. Which is why, if you like, countries which have had nuclear weapons have found it extraordinarily difficult to think of even using them against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, even when they've been losing wars. And when I say losing wars, they don't lose it militarily, they lose it politically. I think this is a very, very important point here. In the last 150 years, something very odd has happened as compared to all thousands of years before. And that's the fact that there is a growing disjunction between political power and military power. And nuclear weapons are the most extreme form of military power. And this political disjunction, the two are not the same. They are connected, but they're not the same. Means that ideas of thinking about power, like national comprehensive power, etc., have to be rethought. And even the attempts by Nye and others to talk in terms of soft power and smart power are not particularly sophisticated attempts at coming to the complexities of this disjunction. Because what's happened in the last 150 years is the entry of large masses of people into politics. And that has turned the world upside down. You couldn't imagine the kind of developments that we've had in the last 100, 120 years, decolonization, the overthrow of apartheid, all of these things that have taken place as a result of the entries of masses of people. Because ultimately, try and understand what political conflict is all about. Political conflict or political struggle is not above all a contest of arms. It is not above all a contest of economic strength. It is above all a contest of wills in which one side seeks to impose its will on the other side, and its economic and military strength are part of the means by which it seeks to impose its will on the other side. But what happens if that side, which does not have this kind of economic or military power or strength or capacities that the other side has, what happens if that side has a will that is so wide and so deep, e.g. nationalism, etc., that it is not going to give up? And it will continue to fight. And that changes the relation of forces. Ironically, one of the problems that has also emerged for the United States, for example, is that its capacity to inflict violence is reaching infinity. But its capacity to absorb violence, in terms of deaths of its own soldiers and civilians, is asymptotically going towards lower and lower, which creates a huge problem. In fact, one of the real dangers of what's going to happen in the future is this whole business of drones, and the fact that countries like India, China, Russia and others are going to move in this direction, of moving towards drone warfare and all the kind of issues that it throws up. But that's a different point. But my point here then is that if second, what is the nuclear situation today? The nuclear situation today is something like this. The end of the Cold War means that the threat of nuclear holocaust or a nuclear exchange on a global scale has diminished greatly. At the same time, the possibility of a regional nuclear conflict has arisen. What are the areas? Northeast Asia, the Korean situation, the Middle East, West Asia, Israel, Iran. Third, South Asia, where both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. Let's understand, the Indian and Pakistani governments are not intending to use nuclear weapons against each other. The problem is something called an escalation dynamic. Two sides, starting from a position in which they do not intend to use nuclear weapons against each other, if they are caught in a conflict, that creates its own dynamic in which both sides, which to begin with never thought of using nuclear weapons, suddenly begin to think that maybe we have to consider using nuclear weapons because the other side might. And if you followed the Kargil war in India, you'll have noticed precisely that, in which both sides had to in fact ready the use. And I remember, I think it was J. Dixit at that time, who was saying that, look, we don't want to, this is during the time of the Kabul war, we don't want to use nuclear weapons. But the Pakistanis may think about doing this, so we have to be ready for that. In other words, you create a situation of growing tension, and that can happen. To believe in deterrence is something like this. Deterrence is the irrational belief that extreme fear will always ensure that those who you do not and can never completely control will nevertheless always behave the way you want them to behave. That, in a sense, is what deterrence is all about. So you have a huge number of problems, this whole kind of escalation, proliferation, vertical proliferation, all of these things that are taking place over here. We have a responsibility here in India to try and move towards it. What has happened is that you've had the extension of nuclear weapons-free zones. You have to move towards generating that. We have 5 nuclear weapons-free zones in the world today. There is serious talk, and that's something that we should press for, with regard to the question of a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, where the United States and Israel are the biggest culprits here. There, in Northeast Asia, in fact, contrary to what you might be, the impression you're getting from the newspapers, etc., the biggest culprit is not the North Koreans. The biggest culprit, once again, are the Americans. If you want to understand what is happening in the Korean Peninsula, the most sophisticated and serious analysis does not come from the United States or from Britain or from India. It actually comes from Japan and South Korea. And they are the ones who followed very, very carefully. And you may be surprised to know that in the case of this standoff, etc., the biggest culprits, that doesn't mean that you have to excuse the rhetoric and all that of the North Koreans. But the real problem has been, for a very long time, the United States of America over there. How do you move towards the United States taking some kind of a lead to move towards that? This is where I believe that the question of militarism and opposing militarism, and therefore the necessity to connect the anti-nuclear movement to other kinds of movements, opposition to the United States foreign policy, becomes very, very important. The United States can be politically defeated. It's having problems in Iraq, it's having problems in Afghanistan, there continues to be the huge problem of Palestine, and so on. And if it is politically defeated or weakened, then this automatically raises the issue of what is the value of your military strength? What is the value of your extreme form of military strength, nuclear weapons? It's because people think that nuclear weapons are important. And although the central argument for nuclear weapons is in fact the argument of deterrence, one of the reasons, largely unstated, why governments want nuclear weapons is because they think that nuclear weapons can also provide more general foreign policy support. If you talk to many experts in India about nuclear weapons, this idea that nuclear weapons can provide more general foreign policy support comes across very revealingly in a phrase that is very, very common. And you will find it being used at any number of seminars all over the place. And if you use it yourself and you're applying for the Indian Foreign Service, they'll be very impressed if you use this phrase. Or if you go to any seminar, they'll say, ah yes. And what is that phrase that you will find so many strategic experts from the top level to using and say that, listen, nuclear weapons are a currency of power. How many times have you heard that phrase? Right? What is currency? Money is a unique commodity in human societies. Money is a unique commodity because there is no other commodity that is the universal equivalent, that has its enormous fungibility, which has its enormous exchange power. It can be exchanged for so many different things. Nuclear weapons, the only power they have is a threat power. But when you call nuclear weapons a currency of power, you are convincing yourself and others that it has a property which is precisely the property it doesn't have. It does not have that exchange power by which you can use it to get a good trade agreement, this, that, etc., etc. In other words, it's strategic uselessness. Does it have some impact? Yes, but of a very limited kind at the more intangible levels. What is that? If you, certainly India after 1998, its status has risen in the global order. Insofar as you're dealing with the United States, Russia, China, and a mindset which is largely realist, and which says, oh, having nuclear weapons means that you're an important stuff, then obviously there'll be some kind of an impact at the intangible level here. But in practical, concrete terms, your having nuclear weapons is not going to solve your environmental problems, your development problems. It's not going to be able to get you a great advantage with regard to some new economic deal, or whether you're going to get more shares or quotas in the power in the World Bank, or this, that, etc. It doesn't translate into that. So the idea that nuclear weapons are a currency of power is actually reflective of an extremely sloppy form of thinking. Yeah? I will reserve the question of nuclear terrorism, perhaps to the discussion here. We can talk about that over here. But my basic point here is that we do need to try our very best to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons. We have been lucky. Despite the moral barrier, given the question of escalation dynamic, given the question of its possible spread to other countries, there can certainly arise contexts in which somewhere, sometime, nuclear weapons could be used. As things stand, if they are used, they would be used in some particular local context. I would hate to think that the world is going to become serious, and much more serious about moving towards disarmament, precisely because something like that happens. But that's something that we really have to think about very seriously. As far as we are concerned here in India about the anti-nuclear movement, it's connected to the anti-nuclear energy movement for a variety of reasons that we can talk about over here. It also has to be connected to the whole question of militarism and development in various ways that we can also do here. And that, of course, is a larger issue which goes into the question of the tactics and strategies of building an anti-nuclear movement in India, especially in a context in which you don't have the same kind of historical middle-class progressive kind of elements and so on. You don't have a great sense of fear. Ironically, unlike in the case of Britain, in the case of US and Russia, for many reasons, which are obvious, there is not that sense of fear. That is the basis. Now this is in one sense makes our task more difficult, but in another sense it also means that we have the responsibility of trying to build a more stable and sustainable peace and anti-nuclear movement on sentiments that go beyond the question of fear. And that, of course, is another issue, a larger issue. I think I better stop here. Thank you very much. Are two different things. You don't have to be a complete pacifist to oppose nuclear weapons. I'm not a complete pacifist. I think there's a place for conventional weaponry, right? But then you have to decide. For the case of India, for example, we're living in a context, no matter what our aspirations of the future are, that you do need to have some degree of military security, but what do we mean by that? Right? You can go in two directions. You can either say that we need to have enough conventional military power to protect our territory. That's one. Or we need enough military power to power project. Different countries take different decisions with regard to the question of power projection. It's not axiomatic that big countries with huge population and large territories will necessarily go in for power projection. If you say that we want enough to be able to protect our borders and our areas, right? Then there'll still be differences about how much you need, but they will be of a qualitatively different level from those who insist that you have to power project. China wants to power project. India wants to power project, right? Brazil is not so preoccupied with wanting to power project. A population, a country of 90 million, which needs no lessons from anybody else in how to be independent, doesn't want to power project. Vietnam, right? But a country like Britain, given its history, 60 million population, wants to power project, right? A small country of what, 9 million, 10 million population, Sweden, conscription, very sophisticated, doesn't want to power project. Israel, a country of 6 million, wants to power project. So the question of militarism and how much you want to move in that direction is again going to be related to the politics of the leading strata and their own perspective. So they can give you arguments, in order for us to protect India, we must of course have a blue water navy, blah blah, etc., whatever, all these things here. Right? Countries go in for nuclear weapons basically for two reasons. They go in for, or a combination of two, in which one is more important than the other. Threat perceptions or self-perceptions. Threat perceptions, self-perception. The United States went in for nuclear weapons because of self-perceptions, to send a message to the Soviet Union. Nobody else had nuclear weapons. By 1944, they knew that the Germans don't have it. Countries like Russia and China for threat perceptions. The Americans have it, we have to have it. Right? Britain, France, self-perceptions. Declining colonial powers, this is how we'll sit at the high table. India, much more like Britain, United States, Russia. Pakistan, much more, sorry, not Russia, Britain, United States, France. Pakistan, much more like Russia and China. If the Indians have it, we have to have it. So what happens is that, as I somewhat said sometimes facetiously, there is a national nuclear security song of Pakistan and there is the national nuclear security song of India. How does the national nuclear security song of Pakistan go? And relax, I'm not going to sing it. It goes like this. India, 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 India. That's it. What is the national nuclear security of India? Pakistan, Pakistan. No, China, no, China. Oh, China and Pakistan, China. No, big short country, big short country. Very facetiously, but these are the essential arguments that are given here about here. So one has to make a distinction there. About the anti-nuclear movement in India, India is an anti-nuclear energy movement. The three countries that have the most ambitious plans at the level of nuclear energy are Russia, China and India. But India is the one country, given its relative democratic character, which has large and growing anti-nuclear mass movements. But anti-nuclear mass movements in India also go through different stages. The first stage, livelihood concerns. What will affect us locally? Livelihood. Fishermen, land acquisition, this, that, etc. Second stage, safety. The other question. The Kudankulam movement has gone beyond that. You go beyond that when you move to a stage in which you don't just say NIMBY. You don't just say not in my backyard. But you oppose it frontally and aggressively nowhere. Right? It does not axiomatically follow that the first stage, livelihoods, second stage, safety, will go to that stage. But in Kudankulam, it has gone so. And it has gone so not just among a small leadership, it's done so on a mass scale. And this is a tremendous tribute to Uday Kumar and so many others who have been part of that, who have generated that awareness, if you like, about that. And it is interesting that the pro-nuclear energy lobby and group in India have not come out strongly against what is extraordinary. And that is that the degree of repression that has been lodged and held like a Damocles sword, over 8,000 sedition charges. Huh? Do you have any sedition charges for 2002 Gujarat? Do you have any sedition charges on 1984 Sikh riots? Huh? Where do you have sedition charges? And yet you have over 8,000 waging war against the state in this area because they want to send in a message. The anti-nuclear energy movement in India, and in Kodakode in particular, is raising questions at 4 levels. It's raising the question at the level of nuclear energy. No, we don't want it there. It's raising a question at the level of democracy. Why is it that the pro-nuclear lobby here, which can be made pro-nuclear, can say, we think you're wrong, you're talking nonsense, we have to have nuclear energy, we have to have the base. Why is it not come out fiercely and strongly against the brutal democratic repression that's taking place in Kuram for a movement that is so peaceful and Gandhian-like? Where are the newspaper editorials and so on, which are indicting the Indian government, saying we are not against nuclear energy, but how on earth can you have this kind of repression and do that? It has raised questions about the nature of Indian democracy. Third, it has raised the question of development, because nuclear energy only makes sense if you're going to pursue an economic policy of highly centralized, high energy intensive development, which of course is related to ecological issues and so many other issues that also take place. So you've got at the level of nuclear energy, at the level of democracy, and at the level of your whole development perspective here. And the fourth is that one of the most important reasons why this is taking place is connected to the Indo-US nuclear deal, in which there are assurances given, and the Americans and the Russians and the French are in fact saying, and the Americans in particular, what is our payback for what we did to help you get the Indo-US nuclear deal, to clear your situation in the nuclear supplies group, etc. So the fourth level is the question of foreign policy and the Indian government's reaction here. You might be surprised to know that the first public explanation for why the Indian government had its test in 1998 was never given to the Indian public. On May 11th, when the test took place, Vajpayee comes on radio and says such and such bomb or such and such explosion have taken place. The first public explanation he gives is in a letter to the President of the United States of America, which is released, in which of course he talks about Pakistan and China. That creates a diplomatic faux pas. So within a month, they have to say that this is not country specific, because they cited China, this thing here. And within a year, the government says that it's not even threat specific. In fact, a confirmation of the idea that in fact, that it was basically status driven. I've written about it, there are many views, I won't get into that here. But on the question of nuclearization, militarization, I would see it much more in these terms. I'm sorry if I've given you a sort of long answer to a short question.
Sir, I'm Bhavna, PhD student.
The moral dimension and the fact that even when you have warfare, there are fundamental humanitarian principles that you have to follow in warfare. And therefore they indicted nuclear weapons on the basis of its violating the fundamental humanitarian principles even in warfare, right? So they highlighted that humanitarian dimension, and that moral dimension continues to be a very important aspect in the attempt to generate opposition towards nuclear weapons. Very recently in Norway, for example, there was an international conference which again highlights this aspect. You have to try to build a movement. You have to try and capture the moral imagination of enough people. Right? Nuclear weapons you require to carry the moral imagination, particularly in India. Most people in India, or much, I should say most people, but many people do not have a sense of the unique horror of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, if you're not a complete pacifist, you can recognize that you can use a bandook or you can use a tank for good purposes, to protect your country, to do that, etc. But nuclear weapons, being weapons of mass destruction, can never be used for good purposes. Because there are principles and rules of humanitarian warfare. Right? That puts them into a different category, morally speaking, ethically speaking. Although there have been attempts to also ethically justify nuclear weapons in some way or the other, they're extremely weak arguments. So that highlights this extremely important aspect about the negativity which has to be utilized in order to bring people around. When you say that we need nuclear weapons for our protection, what you're basically saying is that we must have the right to threaten mass murder against women, children, elderly civilians in Pakistan and China, and they vice versa. But you don't have that right. You just don't have that right. In fact, the irony is that nuclear weapons, which can cause tremendous damage to future generations, you are actually postulating something which is extraordinary. In order to have my particular security, I must have the right or the capacity to threaten the existence of the future generations and planets themselves. What particular issue can justify this thing? Right? You are not even justified in having nuclear weapons and not using them, because having them constitutes a threat. It is in fact a weapon of terror. This is how Winston Churchill said. In fact, after 1945, he said, from now on, peace will be the sturdy child of terror. One of the developments that are taking place even in international relations thinking, more recent developments of course, is to bring in the emancipatory and the moral dimension more and more. And therefore you have that dimension here. In which case, please understand what deterrence is. Deterrence is a terrorist doctrine. That's what it is. Morally speaking, deterrence is a terrorist doctrine. Many people don't see it like that way. So that aspect, I think, is very, very important. And one of the countries that in fact said that nuclear weapons was abhorrent and that and cited the ICJ ruling once upon a time before it went in for nuclear weapons was of course India. But that's the Indian elite has changed to a very great extent here. North Korea, and doesn't North Korea require nuclear weapons there? Understand the logic of nuclear weapons. You are not going to protect yourself against another country's nuclear weapons simply by having nuclear weapons. You have to have the ability in a second strike to threaten it. Even today, India cannot protect itself if the United States decides to throw nuclear weapons on India. India doesn't have nuclear weapons that can reach the United States. Right? So it is not enough. This is an argument that is often being used by the left. If Iraq had nuclear weapons, then they would not have intervened. But the logic of that is that Iraq must have had nuclear weapons to be able to, reach the United States. In the case of North Korea, if you look at the history of what it is, the North Koreans were agreeable in 1994 to the denuclearization of Korea. Until very, very recently, now I'm not so sure, but until very, very recently, what the North Koreans were doing were not going in for nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons test in order to have a deterrent, but in order to increase their bargaining power, in order to exchange, if you like, for a long-term stabilization of the situation there. Because what happened earlier was that the North Korean elite and the government has recognized that their own internal situation is a disaster. They have to move away from the kind of economy that they have. They require, above all, desperately need, most importantly, they need Japanese support. They cannot get Japanese support unless there is a normalization of relations between Japan and Korea. There cannot be a normalization of relations between Japan and Korea unless there is normalization of relations between the United States and Korea. And this is, in a certain sense, what they've been pressing for, bargaining for. The other thing is that be very careful when you use this kind of argument that Iraq have it, and this, again, it's a counterfactual. But I have heard the late K. Subramaniam and others say that if Japan had nuclear weapons, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not have happened. this is an extraordinary approach to history or towards historical possibilities. It's a kind of approach in which you parachute into history, into what could have been, what might have been, take it out for the purposes of rationalizing what you're doing. But you treat it with irresponsibility. You don't ask yourself the question that if Japan had nuclear weapons, then what would have happened to the whole nature of the Second World War? Would they not possibly have shared these nuclear weapons with Germany? What then would have been the outcome of the Second World War? You don't do that. All you do is you go in, parachute, grab something from there in order to sustain your argument that look, deterrence works. If you are going to go into history, then respect the logic of history and respect the logic of the historical construction that you're going to do. Don't treat it so cavalierly. Let me give you another example. General Sundarji used to say, can you guarantee that China will not use nuclear weapons against India? We must have nuclear weapons. The answer to the question, can you guarantee? No, we can't guarantee. Huh? Therefore, India must have nuclear weapons because you can't guarantee that China may not use the nuclear weapons against India. 100% guarantee whatever you can't do. Okay? Absolutely. Okay. In which case, but if India then gets nuclear weapons, China could attack India and destroy its nuclear weapons straight away because India, even after it gets a bomb, can't do anything against China. Did you know what Sundarji said? He said, but you know, China will not do this. If you look at the history of how China behaves, it will not do this, and he's right. Unless, of course, you create a problem in Tibet, which we're not going to really do. So what has he done? He has jumped when it suits him. And this is, of course, the whole nature of strategic thinking related to nuclear weapons. He has jumped from abstract possibilist arguments, which we must have nuclear weapons because they could do that, you can't guarantee, to historically grounded probabilistic arguments to say that if you have nuclear weapons, China will not attack you. Why not use historically grounded probabilistic arguments for not having nuclear weapons in the first place? But this kind of treatment, you see, strategic thinking cannot but be speculative. Since it cannot but be speculative, you have to try to think strategically in as intelligent a manner as you can. What does it mean to think intelligently or to speculate intelligently? It means that you should obey two principles. The evidential principle of what is there and the principle of logical consistency of argument. The historical reality about deterrence is greatly undermined by the existing overkill that exists here. And the logic in deterrence is deeply, by its very nature, flawed, which I tried to show by giving you various examples. If you like, here's another way of, an aphoristic way of getting the same point. What creates the risk of nuclear war? What creates the risk of nuclear war? Any answers? What?
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, right? How best to deal with the risk of nuclear war? Have nuclear weapons. You've got a problem, right? Yeah? The question of Iraq having this, that, etc., whatever here, and in fact, the likelihood of Israel getting a green signal to attack Iran is precisely if Iran does go in. It gets much, much greater if Iran does go in for getting having nuclear weapons, etc. So I would say that be careful about the North Korean kind of argument here, that they would not be here. One of the more important reasons why it would be difficult for the United States to attack North Korea is even its geopolitical emplacement next to China and Russia, and the relationship between China and Russia. It becomes a bigger thing in that way also. But keep in mind the fact, I'm watching at the situation in North Korea. I'm wondering whether the leadership is still going to stick to that old perspective of using it as bargaining chips, or whether there's now a new change, etc. one will just have to wait and see and assess that. On the question of global zero, we have to move both vertically and horizontally to reducing. You're not going to have a big bang disarmament. You're going to have to move towards steps in that. And there have been suggestions about various steps that one can take to move towards nuclear disarmament. Yeah. And that's what we have to think of. And there are a number of suggestions, for example, that you can take. And that is that one view is that Rebecca Johnson has put forward as have an international conference in which you come out very strongly saying that we must reject the question of ever engaging in a nuclear war. And even nuclear weapon states should be a party to such a conference and say no. Huh? It creates a certain contradiction because the credibility of your deterrence is based upon your opponent recognizing your willingness to use it. But at the same time, that's one view that, of course, just get rid of, under no question, are we to use it. Earlier, there used to be talk about having a no first use perspective. It's interesting that China and India are the two countries that have a no first use declaration. China's is in fact stronger than that of India's. Huh? Yeah. You have the whole question of the fissile material cut-off steps. But incidentally, Pakistan's position is better than India's. Pakistan says take into consideration stockpiles. India says don't take into consideration stockpiles. What would be a compromise there? Okay, don't reduce stockpiles, but have some international monitoring mechanisms for the stockpiles, etc. Huh? The Indian position is that we'll have more and more stockpiles. By the time such treaty comes in to cut off production, we'll have enough, and so on, etc. So these are all different, this thing here. Moving towards a nuclear weapons-free zone in here. There, the biggest problem is that Israel says that we will not have any such thing short of a complete peace settlement, which means that they're filibustering. And we should be putting pressure on the United States and elsewhere to move toward. So there are a whole series of pressures here. In India, if you have a no first use declaration, it means that you are going to abjure tactical weapons. You're only going to have nuclear weapons for population centers. But the Indian government is moving towards tactical weapons, triadic deployment, etc., in contradiction to its no first use. The Chinese have also done the same thing. How do you put pressure on India and Pakistan to do that? And there are a series of things that one has suggested. I've suggested a number of things, for example, to do that. Having, if you on both sides, a corridor in which you do not place short-range missiles. I have suggested that why not declare Kashmir a nuclear weapons-free zone on both sides of the border. Huh? The West says, oh, China, India and Pakistan are the two countries that have nuclear weapons. They have a hot-cold war. Kashmir can be a nuclear flashpoint. The Indian and Pakistani governments don't like this. And then you'll have our strategic experts say, oh, you think we brown people are not as sophisticated in controlling our nuclear weapons as you white people or whatever? Oh, you find all kinds of arguments for saying that here. They don't like it. Okay, in case you don't like it, then why don't you declare both sides of the border, Kashmir, to be a nuclear weapons-free zone? It doesn't affect Pakistan and India because they don't have nuclear weapons in that area. They can still maintain their deterrent, they can still develop it and so on. Why not do that? Right? That becomes a political riposte, if you like, to other countries saying, look, we are very responsible, this is it. However, will they do it? Probably not. Why? For two reasons, in my view. But that doesn't mean that we should not put pressure. In fact, one political party in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir has already come around. They won't do that because they don't like the idea of any kind of proposal that unifies Kashmir as a whole. They'd like to keep it there. The second is they're a little bit worried about the thin end of the wedge coming in. If you're rationalizing nuclear weapons-free zones in this part of India, then what are you going to do about that? I give you another proposal. I've gone to Nepal myself and I've suggested. And the Nepalis have liked it. But the Indian government will put pressure on them. What could make Nepal distinctive in the whole world? Mongolia has declared itself a single-state nuclear weapons-free zone, which is different from Austria saying nuclear-free Austria. Because if you're a single-state nuclear weapons-free zone, you call upon other countries who are nuclear weapon states to sign the protocol. The Indian attitude towards the Bangkok Treaty and elsewhere, oppose South Asian nuclear weapons-free zone, but we will recognize the Bangkok Treaty and all, because they would like to be recognized as a nuclear weapons power, signing that, etc. But no to the South Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. Okay, Bangladesh is one country which is the only country which has said there should be a South Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. Right? The Sri Lankans, of course, haven't said it. Nepal can become the first country in the world to have in its constitution the establishment of a single-state nuclear weapons-free zone. This is popular among many, many Nepalis, including because this makes them distinctive. The whole world will say, oh my God, Nepal is the only country in the world which has a constitution like this. Look how distinctive the Nepalis are. It frees the ego. And this is something, and what can India do? India will not like it. Huh? Yeah, but it could do so, but the Indians are going to put pressure. But this is something that the Nepali Maoists are open to. The youth Congress people I've talked to within the Nepali Congress are open to. The Nepali Congress, which way it will go, etc., whatever. The UML could also be attracted here. These are all things you are actually, if you like, doing various political things to actually move in that direction to generate here. So these are a whole range of proposals and activities that we can do. And apart from that, as I said, if we're trying to delegitimize nuclear weapons and so on, and this is particularly important for your younger generation because you're going to have to carry on the fight, is that you have to decide for yourself what is your attitude towards the question of nuclear generation. And be very, very important and pay attention to the moral dimension. Nelson Mandela was once asked, at what point did you know that you were going to succeed in your struggle against apartheid? And he said, we realized that we were going to succeed in the struggle against apartheid when we realized that we had captured the moral imagination of enough people. He didn't say the majority of people, he said enough people. And if you're going to be in the feminist movement, if you're going to be in any progressive movement, and in this era of mass politics and mass movements, the moral dimension is absolutely central. Look at the degeneration of our own Indian scientists, who have come from C.V. Raman to the middle class hero, Abdul Kalam. Look at the degeneration. Once upon a time, our scientists are necessary evil. At least they said it's evil. In which case, why do you have the celebration that you had in India, when India had nuclear weapons? When 1998 took place, I was looking and I was saying, is there one, I could not see one person who supported nuclear weapons saying the following. One strategic expert, one academic, one journalist, one politician, one whatever, media person, one scientist, whatever, who supported nuclear weapons in India going nuclear in 1998, saying this much. We regret India having to go nuclear. We regret having to use our scientists to produce this when they should have been producing other much more progressive things. But we have to do this because the Chinese have similarly misused their scientists and this, that, to do that. They could have at least said this much. Not a single person in the public eye who supported nuclear weapons across the range said even this much. Why not? What does it indicate? It indicates an absence of moral sensitivity. And that question of moral sensitivity is fundamental. How on earth are you going to get rid of sexism, racism, apartheid, this, that, etc., if you do not have that moral sensitivity? One of the tragedies here is that the kind of support that you got in India, and to a lesser extent in Pakistan, was in fact more than you had in any other country that went nuclear in terms of, oh, this thing here, this thing. India stands up pride, megatons of pride, and this thing, all the rest of it. And it's an indication, if you like, of the changed moral character of the Indian, in quotes, middle class, which extends to a whole range of other issues, etc. In my view, for example, this is a general debate that you have to take into consideration in political science. You have on one hand all the liberals, Kilnani and this and that, and Goa, taking the view that Indian democracy has stabilized itself and is remarkable and this, that here. And another view which says that in fact it's degenerating, it's authoritarian drift and so on. You have two different things. Don't minimize the strengths, but don't minimize the enormous weaknesses, but what's the overall drift? For me, and people of my views, etc., the very fact that the center of gravity has shifted to the right is itself an indication of the less democratic drift that's taking place. And one of the most important factors, in my view, is this so-called reactionary, politically reactionary middle class. It's complex, etc., but it's basically been a very important foundation for, in my view, a right-wing shift, and so on, etc. So the question of morality comes in, and nuclear weapons bring out this question of morality in a way that very few other things can bring out here.